One, 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 one. Oh yeah. Okay. So.
My colleagues who aren't as diligent about time as I am will be coming along. I believe on both sides of the aisle, we have commissioners that are going to join us this morning. It's hard to believe that almost 6 years have passed, 5 of which Oleg Sentsov was in prison most of that time. Just as it did in Georgia in 2008, Russia defied international law and, in a sudden brazen display of revanchism, rewrote the borders of a sovereign nation. Of course, we know how Crimea was just the opening salvo in President Putin's, I guess he's still president. It seems like last week or two he's been reforming everything so he can be leader for life. But his campaign to stop what he saw as the inexorable movement of a fledgling democracy towards greater integration with the West, its values, and its institution. A little disclaimer here. At the time that the Orange Revolution took place, I was the lead monitor for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in that election. So I saw firsthand some of the beginnings of change. And I might add, I went back as the lead monitor for the second election. And I felt in both instances that the elections were handled appropriately. To Mr. Putin, the Ukrainian people's desire for closer ties to the European Union, for stronger democratic institutions, and for an end to endemic corruption was impermissible. So he did the unthinkable. And though through blatant subterfuge and an utter disregard for international law, he took by force a part of Ukraine's sovereign territory, changing forever the lives of the people who lived there. He went on to instigate a bloody conflict that's ongoing in Eastern Europe at the cost of, so far, 13,000 dead and many thousands more injured or displaced. Putin did all of this in order to stymie Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Today, we're here to talk about the lives of the people who live under the heavy hand of Russia-occupied Crimea. Some have been forced to flee their homes, some to give up their fundamental freedoms of expression and worship, and even their ethnic and cultural identity in order to survive. Through a variety of hardline methods, including forced citizenship, sham referendums, legal intimidation, disinformation, and prohibitions on access to and use of a Ukrainian language. Russian authorities have sought to stifle dissent and project to the world the false image of a prosperous, free Crimea. I was never in Crimea, but I read a lot about all of Ukraine when I was doing work there. And my understanding before all of this intervention, Crimea was flourishing, particularly in the area of tourism. And I also know for a fact, with discussions with Ukrainian leaders, that there was a very strong leaning of Ukraine to join NATO at some point in their future. By limiting access to the international and Ukrainian human rights organizations, the Kremlin has effectively created a veil between Crimea and the rest of the world. This morning, we have 3 respected witnesses with us who will pull back the veil and show us the harsh reality of Russia's oppressive occupation, one which includes arbitrary arrests, harassment, imprisonment, censorship, and other brutal tactics aimed at forcing a proud people into submission, whether they be civil or society activists, community or religious leaders, artists, journalists, or simply those whose religion and ethnicity are viewed with distrust and fear. The goal of today's hearing is to shine a light on the human rights situation in Crimea and to send a clear signal to the people there that the United States Congress, particularly Al C. Hastings, the Helsinki Commission, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe have not forgotten about your plight. First to speak is a man who comes to symbolize through his courage and moral strength all those Crimeans who refuse to bend to the Kremlin's will. Oleg Sentsov is a Ukrainian filmmaker and director who was detained by Russian authorities in May of 2014 on trumped-up charges of terrorism and was sentenced to 20 years in a Russian prison. But he refused to be silenced. In 2018, he began a hunger strike that lasted 145 days to call for the release of all Ukrainian political prisoners held in Russia. Capturing the world's attention to his and his countrymen's plight, this nation and Congress never forgot about you, Mr. Sentsov, and it moves me greatly to have you here with us, once again, a free man. When I just met you, I told you I thank you for your courage. I really, really do. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on the situation in Crimea. Next, we'll have Ms. Tamila Tashiva, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. That takes a lot of courage also, and you'll deeply appreciate it. Before being named to her current position, Ms. Tashiva worked as a co-founder and head of Crime SOS, a human rights group focused on the plight of internally displaced persons, as well as the overall human rights situation in Crimea. She was also a volunteer during the Euromaidan prior to 2014. Ms. Tashiva was a civil society activist and organizer of events and initiatives highlighting the religious and ethnic culture of Crimea. I welcome you, Ms. Tashiva, to today's hearing, and we appreciate your participation. And lastly, and I'm not going to go back through their biographies. I believe you'll find at the desk outside further information on all of them. Lastly, we have Ms. Melinda Herring, who is Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Previously, Ms. Harris was the editor of the Council's Ukraine Alert blog that she controlled. She is a longtime observer of the region whose work has been published by NPR, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. Footnote there, I wish we had a great deal, and I'm talking about Congress now to you all, I wish we had a great deal more Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And I'm an advocate for funding them appropriately, which we have not been doing for a decade, in my judgment. She's appeared in the Washington Post and other prominent outlets. Over the course of her career, Ms. Herring has worked for Eurasia Foundation, Freedom House, and the National Democratic Institute. In addition to her duties with the Atlantic Council, she is also vice chair of the board of East Europe Foundation in Kiev and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. welcome Ms. Harris, and thank you for your testimony today. I turn now to Mr. Sensoff for any offering that he may wish to make. Thank you, sir.
Всем доброе утро. Спасибо большое за приглашение принять участие в этой комиссии.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this commission.
Я стараюсь говорить только о том, что я пережил сам, что я видел сам, в чем я абсолютно уверен.
I will speak about what I experienced and what other people experienced as well.
Поэтому могу вам рассказать только про первые 2 месяца оккупации, когда я был в Крыму.
During and after the occupation of the Crimea.
После того, как победила наша революция достоинства 22 февраля 2014 года,
When the Revolution of Dignity won a victory, which was on February 22nd, 2014, excuse me.
когда мы свергли преступного правительства Януковича, который являлся прямым подчиненным Путина,
When we displaced the government of Yanukovych, who was directly subordinating to Putin.
Путин, поняв, что теряет всю Украину, которая выходит из орбиты его влияния, решил забрать хоть что-нибудь.
Putin realized that he was losing Ukraine as a sphere of influence and decided to take at least something.
Он решил забрать Крым,
He decided to take the Crimea,
потому что там проживало много русскоязычного населения.
because that's where many Russian-speaking people were residing.
Крым когда-то давно входил в состав Российской империи,
And earlier, Crimea had been at some point a part of the Russian Empire.
и в Крыму базировалась база российского флота, было много российских
And the
военнослужащих.
Crimea was the home to a Russian naval base.
Россия очень много любит говорить о том, что произошел какой-то законный референдум,
Russia likes to say that there was some allegedly legal referendum
волеизъявление народа Крыма.
about the Crimean people will expression,
Но это не имеет никакого отношения к реальности.
but this has nothing to do with the reality.
В реальности это была военная операция, военный захват, оккупация Крыма,
In reality, this was a military occupation and a seizure of territory.
которая началась в ночь 26 февраля 2014 года.
It started on the night of February 26th, 2014.
За 3 недели до так называемого референдума.
This was 3 weeks before the so-called referendum.
Военные люди без опознавательных знаков,
Military servicemen without any insignia,
в которых очень легко угадывались российские военнослужащие по их оружию, одежде и произношению
who
акцента.
would be easily recognized
Little
as
green men.
маленькие зеленые человечки. One could easily see they were Russian regular military servicemen because of the equipment, the weapons, and the way they spoke.
Они не скрывали того, что они россияне,
They did not actually conceal that they were Russians.
и часть населения это приветствовала, а часть была против.
So part of the people welcomed that, but a part was against it.
Но выступать против было невозможно,
But it was impossible to object
потому что везде были военные патрули,
because military patrols were everywhere.
устраивались пулеметные гнезда на перекрестках
They set up machine guns at street intersections,
и патрулировали броневики.
and armored cars were patrolling streets as well.
Не только с военной базы Севастополя, но и после захвата Керчи, переправы с материковой части России начали поступать военные колонны с военной техникой.
And then military columns were moving out of Sevastopol, the naval base, but also from Kerch, from across the strait, from the Russian
В течение
territory.
нескольких дней весь Крым был наводнен российской техникой и российскими военными.
So within a few days, the Crimea was flooded with Russian military and Russian military vehicles.
На военных машинах, грузовиках даже не снимали российские военные знаки.
Russian military vehicles, trucks did not even have their license plates removed.
Настолько они чувствовали себя уверенно, что ничего не боялись, не
They
скрывали.
felt so confident, they were not scared of anything.
И я и множество других крымчан, которые занимали проукраинскую позицию, пытались выступать против этого.
Me, as well as many other Crimeans who were against this, tried to speak out and do something against it.
Мы устраивали демонстрации, акции протеста,
We were setting up protest and rallies against it,
но это было очень опасно, потому что нам не давали этого делать.
But this was dangerous because we were facing obstacles.
Разгоняли, арестовали наших активистов.
Our actions were dispersed and our activists got arrested.
Некоторые активисты пропадали без вести.
Some activists were missing, were disappearing,
А некоторых находили уже убитыми.
and some were found killed.
Очень быстро наступила атмосфера страха,
Very soon, there was established an atmosphere of fear,
когда ничего нельзя было говорить против России, против
when you
этого
could not
захвата,
say anything against Russia.
еще задолго до начала этого референдума.
And this was long before that referendum came.
Одновременно с этим с материковой части России завозилось множество пропагандистов и российских активистов,
At the same time, Russia deployed and utilized its propaganda specialists and pro-Russian activists.
которые разворачивали российскую символику, устраивали митинги и кричали «Россия, Россия».
They were installing symbols of Russia and setting up rallies and shouting Russia, Russia.
Но российский акцент отличается от крымского.
But it's obvious when you hear a person from Russia speak, they have a different accent than the Crimeans speak
Было
in Russian.
хорошо заметно, что это политический спектакль, инспирирован Россией, что это привезенные актеры.
It was obvious that this was a political show staged by people brought in from Russia.
Но это было сделано для того, чтобы показать картинку по российскому пропагандистическому телевидению, что крымчане приветствуют приход России.
But this was being done to make a picture, a nice picture for Russian TV, propaganda picture showing that Crimeans allegedly support Russia.
Для того, чтобы увеличивать эту атмосферу страха и подавлять какое-либо сопротивление к российской агрессии, было придумано в том числе наше дело.
And in order to maintain this atmosphere of fear and suppress any desire to resist, our criminal case was fabricated in part.
Чтобы все поняли, что любое сопротивление бесполезно.
This was to show everyone and make them understand that any resistance is futile.
Они сфабриковали это дело о якобы диверсионной террористической группе, которая готовила какие-то взрывы.
So they fabricated this case, alleging that I was part of some group that was preparing some explosions.
Часть нас, все задержанные подвергались пыткам и допросам жестоким.
All those detained, arrested on those charges were tortured during interrogations
Потому что никаких доказательств не было, ни взрывчатки, ни оружия, ничего не было.
because there were no proofs, no explosives, no weapons, nothing.
Но не все готовы удержать пытки, поэтому некоторые из них дали показания признательные.
But not everyone can stand tortures. That's why some made confessions.
От которых затем отказались в суде, но это нам не помогло, нас все равно осудили.
They later refused from those earlier testimonies during the court.
Mr. Sentsov, what were some of the things that they did to you, if you don't mind? I know that's difficult to talk about, but
Пытки, ну, во-первых, избиение руками, ногами, дубинками,
Beatings of people with arms, legs, and batons.
удушение пакетом,
Suffocating them with a plastic bag.
это очень простая и очень эффективная пытка.
This is a very simple but very effective torture.
Я это видел много раз в кино, в том числе американском.
I've only seen this prior to that, I saw this only in an American movie or some other movies.
И не мог понять, почему люди ломаются. Там, вот это
And when I saw that in the movie, I could not understand why it breaks people so apparently easily.
Но когда тебе не дают дышать и нарушают самый главный твой инстинкт дыхания,
But when they deprive you of breathing, that impacts your most basic instinct to breathe.
тебя охватывает настолько невероятный животный страх, с которым очень трудно побороться.
You're seized by very strong, like animal fear, and you can't resist it.
Тебе хочется так жить, что ты готов что угодно подписать.
You are willing to survive so strongly, you're ready to say anything.
Но я не подписал, поэтому меня осудили на 20 лет. Я не подписал, поэтому меня осудили на 20 лет.
But I did not sign what they wanted. That's why I was given this sentence of 20 years imprisonment.
потому что мне предлагали сделку, если дам показания, нужные на руководство Украины, то мне дадут 7 лет всего лишь.
They proposed me a deal, saying if I testify against Ukrainian leaders, I will only get 7 years in prison.
Я отказался от всего этого.
And I refused to do that.
Затем, уже будучи в российской тюрьме, я совершенно случайно в соседней камере пересекся с военнослужащим российским.
While I was in the Russian prison afterwards, I incidentally intersected with a Russian military serviceman who was in a neighboring cell.
Это был солдат, бывший военнослужащий российского спецназа, так называемого ГРУ.
He was a former serviceman of the Russian Spetsnaz, the Special Operation Force of the GRU.
Он был осужден за криминальные преступления, которые совершил на воле.
He was sentenced for criminal offenses performed.
Будучи пьяным, он убил полицейского.
While he was drunk, he killed a police officer.
Но он мне рассказал про Крым, про захват Крыма.
And he told me more about how Crimea was seized,
Потому что он в нем участвовал.
because he was a part of that operation.
Он сказал, что еще 22 февраля 2014 года,
He said that back on February 22nd of 2014,
то есть в день, когда рухнула власть Януковича,
this was the day when Yanukovych power collapsed.
они получили приказ, и их из Новороссийска, это российский порт, перебросили в Севастополь.
They received orders and were transferred from Novorossiysk, a port in Russia, to Sevastopol in the Crimea.
Где они 3 дня в Севастополе ожидали приказа,
Then they waited for 3 days in Sevastopol for orders to move.
после чего 26 февраля приступили к захвату Крыма.
And then on February 26th, they started occupying the Crimea.
Его показания лишь дополнили общую картину захвата.
So his testimony only added to the picture of this occupation that I knew.
Кроме этого, он рассказал, что после Крыма он участвовал в военных операциях на Донбассе.
He told me that after the Crimea, he was involved in the military action in the Donbass.
Как они заходили с территории России, выполняли операцию в течение недели и уходили обратно.
How they were entering Ukraine's territory from the Russian territory, performing their operations and then leaving back.
Объяснив, что самые серьезные операции военные против украинских войск осуществляли спецназ российский.
And he explained that all the most serious military action against Ukrainian military were done by a Russian Spetsnaz, the Special Operation Force.
Вот, в принципе, все, что я знаю по этому делу. Я думаю, что Тамила дополнит сейчас то, что было после моего ареста уже.
That's all I know on this question, but I'm sure Tamil can add more.
I'll come back and ask you some questions at some time if you don't mind. But Ms. Tashiva?
Honorable Chairman, dear colleagues, it's a great honor to be invited here today to testify about the realities of life under occupation and the state of human rights in Crimea. Almost 6 years have passed since Russia started its aggression against Ukraine by invaded Crimea and initiated hybrid warfare via its proxies in eastern Ukraine. Everybody residing in the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol was forced to get Russian passports, and acts of enforced citizenship unrecognized by Ukraine and international community. In Crimea, it is impossible to live without the Russian passport because people who do not have them are deprived of social services and medical care. Russia's next step was the prosecutions of disloyal groups of population, including Crimean Tatars, who ignored the so-called referendum, and leaders did not recognize Russian jurisdiction over Crimea and ethnic Ukrainians. Russia's instruments of persecution included harassment, imprisonment on political grounds, kidnapping, and murder. At least 20 individuals were killed and 50 kidnapped, of which 15 remain missing and have yet to be found. More than 100 individuals were imprisoned on political grounds, and the houses of at least 350 individuals were searched and their residents detained. Russia cynically imposes its ideology specifically on the young generation. Children and youth are brought up in the spirit of militant patriotism and taught to glorify the occupying state. Such an ideology puts pressure on children and negatively influences their consciousness. According to the occupying authorities, at least 8,500 children in Crimea were incorporated into the military movement, young army. Half of them were inducted as recently as 2019.
Mr. Shiva,
Yeah.
were they boys and girls, or just boys,
Yes,
or do
it's
you know?
boys and girls.
Boys and girls.
Yeah. Since the spring of 2015, Russia launched a recruitment campaign in Crimea for its own military. As a result, at least 20,000 Crimeans were conscripted to Russian military service. Most of the conscripts are sent to military services in faraway regions of the Russian Federation. Since the beginning of the occupation, at least 78 criminal proceedings in Crimea have been initiated against individuals who have avoided their mandatory conscription. During the occupation, the Russian Federation has directly and indirectly displaced the local Crimean population and replaced them with their own citizens. Since the beginning of the occupation, about 1,000 Ukrainian citizens have been forcibly deported. About 42,000 people registered in mainland of Ukraine as internally displaced persons from Crimea. The replacement of the local disloyal Crimean population with the Russian population is ongoing. From 2014 to 2019, estimate suggest between 140,000 and 300,000 Russian citizens changes their place of registration from regions of Russia to the so-called federal city of Sevastopol or Republic of Crimea. The occupying administration plans to increase the numbers of migrants to more than 450,000 people. Following widespread arrest of Crimean Tatars in 2016, a civic movement known as Crimean Solidarity emerged to unite relatives of the imprisoned lawyers and activists. In May 2018, Server Mustafayev, the key coordinator of the movement, was arrested and charged with participation in terrorist organization. On 27 March 2019, mass searches and charge with participation in a terrorist organization took place in the homes of 25 activists in order to harass members of the movement. 24 people were detained after the searches and targeted with the criminal prosecution. The occupying state creates a territory that lacks many rules of law and suppresses any struggle of the local inhabitants for their rights. Due attention should be drawn to the situation of the Crimean Tatars in occupied Crimea. After the beginning of occupation, Russia attempted to bribe key Crimean Tatar leaders to announce their support of Russia. However, after being rejected, Russia started to struggle with the Crimean Tatars by eliminating their national institutions, particularly the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, which was formally banned for extremism. Some leaders of Majlis were criminally prosecuted, harassed, and tortured. On April 19, 2017, the International Court of Justice addressed the case Ukrainians versus the Russian Federation and obliged Russia to reject the exciting limitation to the refrain from further constraining measures against Majlis. The International Court of Justice order has not yet been implemented by the Kremlin. From its side, Ukraine creates all the conditions for preserving, restoring, and supporting communication with its own citizens. Residing in the temporary occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We realize the failures of certain action, including several laws and regulation adopted right after beginning of Crimea occupation regarding poor border crossing condition within the temporary occupied territory, recognition of our own citizens living in occupied territory as non-residents, and other discriminatory regulation as identified by Ukrainian international human rights organizations. But the official policy of Ukraine has now undergone significant changes. It's particular the checkpoints at the administrative border with Crimea were completely equipped and improved, including the construction of service zone. An amendment to the current legislation cancelling discriminatory regulations related to non-resident status was also developed. A new TV channel launch is planned as a source of credible information for the residents of occupied territories to counter Russian propaganda. We express our gratitude to the United States of America for its consistent support of the territorial integrity of Ukraine and assist in countering armed aggression by the Russian Federation. We firmly believe that only through joint effort is it possible to counteract and systematic violation of human rights. On this occasion, we would like to assure you that we recognize the consistent support of the United States in voting for the resolution on Crimea at session of the UN General Assembly during the imposition of the prolongation of sanctions on Russian Federation, and particularly on resolving problem with gas transportation. We highly appreciate Crimean declaration by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, adopted in July 2018. We hope that all European countries will follow suit and adopt their own Crimean declaration. We are convicted that next step should be the creation of an international platform for negotiation on the return of the temporarily occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would welcome your question and comments if you have.
Thank you, Mr. Shiva. I'm known to throw staff off and depart from the regular routine. We don't have any notepads in the audience, but before hearing from Ms. Herring, maybe we could pass around a couple of these that members have not occupied yet. And if any of you in the audience would write a question, I think I'm prepping for what's happening in the Senate. That's how they do that. But just raise your hand and we'll have our staff pick it up. I like to do that because it's kind of hard to just sit up and listen and never have anything to say. But Ms. Herring has a lot to say, so without my involvement anymore, Ms. Herring, we're welcome to hear you.
Thank you, Chairman Hastings, for the opportunity to speak today. Crimea hardly gets any attention, so thank you so much for your leadership and your passion for Ukraine. The human rights situation in Russian-occupied Crimea is acute and getting worse. It merits a hearing as a standalone issue, but I want to provide a little bit of framing beyond all of the grim statistics that we can all throw out. What happens in Crimea has significance that goes beyond the plight of 2 million people who live there. What happens in Crimea may not stay in Crimea. What Moscow is learning in Crimea is how to apply a range of oppressive and coercive tactics to minorities that it perceives as hostile and of questionable loyalty. These insights could be applied elsewhere in Russia, which is home to considerable non-Russian minority populations. How the U.S. government reacts to the ongoing abuses in Crimea will undoubtedly factor into Moscow's calculus on comparable situations in the future. The picture in Crimea is grim. It's no exaggeration to say that the peninsula is becoming a police state. Crimea was once the pearl of the Black Sea and a premier vacation destination, as you noted. It's now bereft of tourists. It's cut off from the world without any access to independent media, and it's a place where occupying authorities use children to spy on their parents. The media is controlled by the government. Independent media sources are forbidden and have been blocked or barred from the peninsula. The good news, though, is that the U.S. government worked quickly to stand up an excellent independent source of information that is flourishing today. Within 3 months of annexation, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Ukraine service launched a website called Crimea Realities, and it tracks all the developments in Crimea in three different languages, in Russian, Ukrainian, and Crimean Tatar. It's the top-ranked news source on Crimea, with approximately 2.4 million visits per month in 2019. I too share your enthusiasm for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and their Ukraine service, I cover Ukraine broadly, is outstanding.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Religious freedom is also a serious concern. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is forbidden in Crimea, and Crimean Tatars are routinely interrogated after Friday prayers. I can go into this in more detail, but the legal code was changed after annexation, and that's a big deal.
And that includes the Jehovah's Witness?
That's correct, sir. That's correct. Another area of concern that Tamila has gone into is education and language rights. I won't belabor that point. Since annexation, 50,000 people, including more than 25,000 Crimean Tatars, have fled. Approximately 500,000 Russians have moved in. They're primarily military personnel and civil servants. The situation is getting worse. According to the Crimean Tatar Resource Center, the number of politically motivated arrests has increased 9-fold in the last 2 years. 100 Crimean political prisoners are being held in Russia. And the problem is, we don't know their name. We know Oleg Sentsov's name, but we don't know the other 100 names.
Right.
And Mr. Chairman, I would love for you to help us get their names out there. That's something that Congress is really good at doing. The FSB is doing its absolute best to stamp out dissenting thought. Up to 200,000 people over the last 6 years have been approached, intimidated, or interrogated by the FSB, and they aren't nice. Here's what they do. They break into your home between 4 and 6 a.m. when your children are sleeping. They sometimes enter from the roof. They brandish automatic weapons and grenades, and they're in full special forces gear. Russia has effectively turned Crimea into a Russian military base. It's no exaggeration to say that Crimea is armed to the teeth. And I have a lot of statistics on APCs and all kinds of gear if you want to talk about it. The Soviet Union's bases on the peninsula have been restored, and anti-aircraft missile systems now line Crimea's perimeter. Additionally, the Russian government may have placed nuclear weapons in Crimea. Perhaps most troubling, though, are reports that the state is using its security services to encourage ordinary people to spy on their neighbors and their families. Given these many challenges, what can the U.S. government do? Continue to speak out unambiguously. Crimea is Ukraine, full stop. Continue to invest heavily in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Ukraine service. This is a lifeline that keeps the people of Crimea from being cut off from the larger world. Help make the names of the 100 Crimean prisoners known. The United States should support cultural, religious, and educational institutions in Ukraine that operate outside of Crimea. Many of them are in Kiev, but support resistance to Russian occupation there. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and passion for Ukraine.
Thank you, Ms. Aaron. We've been joined by United States Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and I'm delighted. I indicated to him that I had not asked questions, but in an effort to let him set up, I'm going to just ask the two that came to me from the audience. And now more. I'll ask these after Senator Sheldon finishes up. How do you see justice in Ukraine in a case of Russia leaving Crimea? It's an interesting question. That's if Russia were to leave, how do you see justice? And I guess another way of putting that would be to compare justice before the intervention with what you're experiencing now.
Главное, чтобы Россия ушла.
What matters is that Russia should leave.
I hear you.
Со всеми остальными вопросами мы после разберемся.
And all those questions that may come up, we'll deal with them later.
All right. The senator and I probably have the very same questions, so I hope I'm not treading in his territory, but this came from the audience, and I was going to ask, what next? And what can the United States Congress do to support Crimean independence? And I ask all three of you that question, and then I'll turn to my friend Senator Whitehouse. Believe it or not, some of us are friends up here.
The Commission on Legal Reform, along with the working group on reintegration, was established at the state level, and the national concept of transitional justice is finalized within the framework. This concept consists of 4 main blocks: compensation for damages to victims, responsibility for crimes committed during the armed conflict, rights to truth and restoration of historical truth, and reform of the security sector. The concept will become the framework for the development of a legal regulation system regarding issue connected with the aggression conducted by Russian Federation. Yes, I am answering for your first question. What has happened after Crimea is the occupation? Because Ukraine work on transitional justice concept, what we do after the occupation, and what we must do before occupation, what are our plans.
Mr. Sensor?
Yes.
Конгресс уже и так мало что сделал.
Regarding the question what the U.S. Congress can do, the U.S. Congress has already done a lot.
Санкции приняты, они пусть не убили Россию, но работают против нее.
The sanctions were adopted. They haven't killed Russia, but they have made an effect.
Последняя санкция по поводу Nord Stream 2 была очень сильная.
This most recent action regarding a Nord Stream project, that was a very powerful step.
Не столько бьет по России экономически, сколько бьет по амбициям Путина.
And it's not that it makes a serious economic impact on Russia, but it heavily impacts Putin's political ambition.
Я надеюсь, эта работа будет продолжена.
And I hope those efforts will continue.
Главное, чтобы не была изменена стратегия давления на примирение.
The most important thing is that the policy would not switch from continuous pressure to efforts to make peace.
Потому что любой попытки примирения Путин считает слабостью.
For Putin, any attempt to make peace is seen as a sign of weakness.
С ним невозможно договориться, потому что он не хочет мира на Украине.
It's impossible to talk with him because he does not want peace in Ukraine.
Он ставит собой цель покорить Украину, контролировать ее, как контролируют все соседние страны.
His goal is to conquer Ukraine and control all neighboring countries of the region.
Украина никогда с этим не смирится, поэтому примирение с Путиным невозможно.
And that's what Ukraine will never accept, which is why making peace with Putin is impossible.
И мы надеемся, что Конгресс на это тоже не пойдет за нашей спиной.
And we hope the Congress will not allow that to happen behind our backs.
продолжить давить по всем фронтам на Путина, помогать Украине до тех пор, пока не победим это террористическое государство.
We need to continue putting pressure on Putin on every front until we defeat this terrorist state.
All right. We've, yes, Ms. Herring, I was going to say before you make your remarks, we've been joined by Commissioner Robert Adderholt, who is the immediate vice chair of this organization. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. As an editor, I don't think I'll surprise you by saying words matter. And the Russians hate it when we call Crimea Russian occupied. So that our words matter. We can continue to speak out and use our voice. And I agree with Mr. Sentsov that Congress has been exemplary. And there's a number of things, though, that I think we can do. Like I said before, helping to make the names of the 100 political prisoners in Crimea known. Let's make them international stars. Don't forget their names. Keep the sanctions on, absolutely. The United States should support cultural, religious, and educational institutions in Ukraine that are based outside of Crimea, but that support the resistance. And I can give you some specific examples if you'd like. We need to continue to invest heavily in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Ukraine service. And I have to admit, this is a thorny problem. There's a debate within the expert community. Are we going to have to wait 50 years like we did in the Baltics? And some people think that. I can tell you that the Crimean Tatar community doesn't think that they have that long. There aren't as many of them. And they think the situation, that the status quo will not hold, and that we have to do something more now.
All right. We've been joined now by the vice chair of the organization, my good colleague and friend, Senator Roger Wicker. And Roger, where we are, we have had opening statements, and I have continued to have a few things to say. I see Gail Wicker just walk in here. Hey, hi, Gail. And we're going to go to Senator Whitehouse, and then if you don't mind, I'll come to you. I'll defer, maybe have one question or so while I get you ready, and then we'll go to Robert. I know you all have a lot of stuff going on.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I don't mind waiting my turn, and people have come here, and
I don't mind yielding to the vice chairman. There's a reason why somebody is a vice chairman. They should get some priority, and Roger, if you want to go ahead, feel free to do so. Go ahead, I'm ready.
You were here first, Senator, so we were
Very well.
just trying
Happy to do it.
Toe the line. Now, Robert, the ball's in your court.
I'm going to defer to the senator,
So if I,
let me just say it's good to be here. I'm still trying to, sorry I was late, I had a previous engagement, but glad to have each of you here, glad to hear your comments on this issue, and this is very informative. This is a big issue for us. We all have friends that are in Ukraine, and so we want to be a friend of Ukraine in every way possible. So, but yeah, let me just pass right now and come back to you a little bit later.
All right, we'll then go to Senator Whitehouse.
let me start with a question for Ms. Herring. History, unfortunately, is an exhibit of instances in which one country occupies another country or the territory of another country. Of those many instances with which our history is replete, are there any that make a good analogy for the nature of Russian occupation of Ukraine today? In some cases, the occupier can be seen as a liberator and afterwards backs off. I think we occupied France at the end of the war, and the French were actually okay with that, and we gave them their country back, and the Marshall Plan kicked in, and everything was great. That was a fairly benign exercise. The exercise of occupation power that preceded that was obviously less benign. And this has happened all around the world. Do you think there's an analogy in history for what the Russians are doing in Crimea in terms of the scope of the oppression? How would you rate it? And either on a scale of 1 to 10 or in terms of a comparison to a previous episode in history?
Well, I have to admit, I'm a political scientist and not a historian, so
You're from the Foreign Relations Institute.
I know. So obviously what the Russians are doing in Crimea is not benign. The comparison that most people draw is to the Baltic states. And the idea
The
basically...
Soviet occupation of the
The
Baltic
Soviet
states.
occupation of the Baltic states. The human rights situation, though, in Crimea is arguably worse there than it is in Russia. The tactics are harsher. The way the things that the FSB is doing to people are worse in Crimea than they are in Russia.
Is there, this would be a question for all of you, is there, in many occupations, there is a resistance that is operating within the occupied territory? Is there a resistance operating against the Russian occupation within Crimea, and how would you describe it?
Я бы согласился с госпожой Мелиндой, о том, что наиболее близкая аналогия – это оккупация Прибалтики в 1940 году Советским Союзом.
Regarding the comparison with occupation of the Baltics by the USSR in 1940,
Когда были введены войска, под какими-то лозунгами проведен фейковый референдум.
at that time, troops were brought in with some mottos and proposing a referendum.
По поводу сопротивления в Крыму. Вот я сопротивлялся.
So yes, there is a comparison. But regarding resistance in the Crimea,
Я сопротивлялся, мне дали 20 лет.
so one example of resistance is myself. I was trying to resist, and I was sent to prison for 20 years.
Я не сделал ничего, просто был против.
And I actually did not do anything, I was just against.
Если ты просто выступаешь против оккупации, говоришь про это, даже если ты какой-то известный человек, режиссер, творческая личность, тебя могут посадить, несмотря ни на что.
If you simply speak out and say you are against, you don't like it, even though you're a public figure, a film director, they can still put you to prison and shut you down.
Демонстрируя всем, что так будет с каждым, кто будет против России.
And this shows to the people that anyone who dares speak against it will have the same fate.
Неприятие России в конце февраля, марте, апреле, после начала вторжения было очень сильное.
After the beginning of the invasion in late February 2014, there was a lot of non-acceptance of Russian invasion.
У той части населения, которая была против этого, проукраински настроенная, в первую очередь крымских татар.
Among those people who were pro-Ukrainian, some of them were Crimean Tatars.
Ну, с российской полицейской, спецслужбистской карательной машиной очень трудно бороться.
But the Russian machine of reprisals with the KGB and other agencies of force, this machine is very hard to fight against.
Посмотрите на российские дела политические. Людей сажают за то, что не вышли на пикет с плакатом, дают 3 года.
If you follow news from Russia, people come out with just a poster on the street and they get 3 years imprisonment for doing that.
За пост в Фейсбуке 4 строчки дают 4 года.
People may get 4 years of prison for just a line they posted on Facebook.
Очень трудно сопротивляться, имея такую серьезную карательную систему.
So it's very hard to do any resistance when you're confronted by such a strong machine of reprisals.
В Крыму ситуация намного хуже.
Whereas in the Crimea, the situation is even much worse.
Там не могут не только посадить в тюрьму, там могут похитить, запытать и убить.
They can not only imprison you, they can kidnap you and kill you.
Все люди это понимают, все люди это знают, поэтому все, кто против, сидят тихо.
Everyone knows this, everyone understands this, therefore everyone's keeping mum.
Тем не менее, отдельные акты проявления непокорности этой власти, в том числе и физического сопротивления, присутствуют.
Whereas acts of disagreement and physical resistance can be found.
Каждый месяц кого-то арестовывают по обвинению в подготовке либо диверсии, либо какой-то акции протеста, либо сопротивлению.
And then people get arrested with charges of preparing some acts of terror or other attacks.
Несмотря на то, что большая часть людей, которые занимали проукраинские позиции, выехали на материк украинский.
even though the majority of those who were pro-Ukrainian at the beginning have fled the territory into Ukraine.
Остается достаточная часть людей в Крыму, которые не принимают эту российскую агрессию, и опять же, в первую очередь, крымские татары.
But then still there are people who do not accept a Russian occupation, primarily, first and foremost, the Crimean Tatars.
И Тамила, как представитель этого района, может вам это про это рассказать.
So Tamila, who represents that nation, can say more.
Representative Tasheva, your thoughts on the occupation and resistance?
Спасибо большое за вопрос.
I want to thank you for your question.
Я бы хотела сказать о том, что оккупация Крыма или попытка аннексии Крыма, она не впервые в истории нашего полуострова.
I want to say that this attempt to occupy and annex Crimea is not the first in the history of our peninsula.
В 1783 году Катерина II уже оккупировала Крым, разрушив крымско-татарскую государственность на
In
территории полуострова.
1783, the previously independent Crimean statehood was ruined by Russian Empress Catherine the Great.
До середины XIX столетия на территории полуострова проживало большинство крымских татар.
The majority of Crimean Tatars physically lived on the territory of the Crimea until mid-19th century.
Государственный язык был крымско-татарский.
And the state language was the Crimean Tatar language.
И поэтому тот миф, который Российская Федерация навязывает, что это земля русской славы, это не так.
So the myth of Russian propaganda of the Russian state that this is allegedly the native land of Russia is wrong.
Оккупация произошла не в 2014 году, к большому сожалению.
So the occupation did not take place in 2014.
Она происходила на протяжении всего периода независимости Украины.
It was continuing all through the times of Ukraine's independence.
Марионетковые структуры, которые существовали на территории полуострова, работали все время независимости страны.
Those marionette administrative bodies that were functioning in the Crimea, they continued working towards that end.
Так называемые украинские медиа, которые существовали в Крыму, напрямую финансировались с территории Российской Федерации.
And the so-called Ukrainian media, which were operating the Crimea at the time, were actually funded from Russia.
И поэтому то, что мы увидели в 2014 году, это было таким заключающим этапом
So what
оккупации
we
Крыма.
all saw happen in 2014 was really the last step in all that development.
Поэтому с нашей стороны, с украинской стороны, мы должны максимально сохранять связи с теми людьми, которые проживают на территории полуострова.
So we in Ukraine need to maintain as close connections as possible with the people who are still residing in the peninsula
Показывать успешность страны Украина,
and show them Ukraine's successes
заботиться о тех жителях, которые живут на временно оккупированной территории.
and provide care for those people who still live in the occupied
И,
territory.
конечно же, продолжать борьбу за возвращение
And
полуострова
we
при
certainly
вашей
need to
поддержке.
continue fighting for returning the peninsula back to Ukraine.
Поэтому очень важно, чтобы мы, наконец, создали платформу для переговоров относительно Крымского
It
полуострова.
is very important to establish a platform for some talks about the future of this peninsula.
Как вы знаете, по поводу Востока есть переговорная площадка, это Минск.
As you know, there is a platform for talks on the future of the territories in the east.
Но у нас нет группы переговорной относительно Крыма,
But we do not have a negotiation group regarding Crimea.
поэтому это очень важно, чтобы с вашей стороны было также участие.
So it is very important that you, the United States, get involved in that as well.
И еще один момент, наверное, отвечая на предыдущий вопрос, чтобы Соединенные Штаты каким образом могли бы помогать Украине,
One other remark in regard to the previous question on how the U.S. could help Ukraine further.
кроме всей той помощи, которая и так
In
оказывается,
addition to all the help that is provided now,
это продолжение поддержки гражданских журналистов, активистов и правозащитных адвокатов в Крыму.
one other thing is continue supporting the civic activists and human rights lawyers in the Crimea,
Потому что они есть, и они продолжают бороться
because
на территории полуострова.
they are there and they continue to make efforts inside the Crimea.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I appreciate your courtesy, I would say that our witnesses are very welcome and much appreciated. I very much regret that our Secretary of State said that Americans don't care about Ukraine, seeming to imply that Americans should not care about Ukraine. I think he is wrong on both counts, and I think your testimony today helps remind us why he is wrong on both counts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. We had, before you all came in, I opened up questions, so the audience wrote down two. And Robert, while you're getting ready, one kind of applies to what was just said by Ms. Toshiba about the organizations on the ground. How can Congress's own exchange program, the Open World Leaderships Center, support your efforts to provide factual information about the occupation to members of Congress? The Open World Program supports congressional diplomacy efforts, and they put both their names, and I'd ask them when we conclude the program, if you would speak with me briefly. I'll inform you where we stand, certainly stand ready to help. But this question was for you, Mr. Sensoff, and I had something similar and full well expected the other questioners will as well. When you were in prison, you met many, well, since being released from prison, you've met many European top officials, including French President Macron. You had a speech at European Parliament, and I would say to you that I beat you there. I spoke to them some years ago. But what would you say to the United States Congress and to our President, Donald Trump? That's the question that came from the audience.
Ну, я бы сказал, конечно, спасибо за поддержку нашей страны
First of all, I would say thank you for support for Ukraine.
и выразил надежду, что американская страна придержится своих договоренностей.
I would also express hope that the American side will stick to the agreements.
Потому что в 1996 году Украина добровольно рассталась с третьим в мире ядерным потенциалом.
Back in the 1990s, as you may remember, Ukraine voluntarily gave up its third largest nuclear arsenal at the time.
Согласно Будапештскому меморандуму.
And there was a Budapest memorandum.
Для того, чтобы после распада Советского Союза на его территории осталась всего одна ядерная держава.
So it was desired that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there would be only one nuclear state among the post-Soviet nations.
За то, что мы отдали реальный ядерный потенциал, мы подписали договор.
So for Ukraine, in exchange for giving away those nuclear weapons, received promises.
Соединенными Штатами, Великобританией и Россией.
This agreement, memorandum was signed by the U.S., Great Britain, and Russia.
О том, что эти три страны будут нас поддерживать и защищать нашу территориальную целостность в случае
And the
угрозы.
promise was that these three countries will support us and protect our territorial integrity.
Но все это перестало работать, когда Россия нарушила свое обещание.
But all that stopped working when Russia broke on that promise.
И я очень надеюсь, что Америка никогда не нарушит свое слово.
Now, I am very hopeful that the United States will never break its word.
И будет помогать защищать Украину от этого реального агрессора
And will continue helping defend Ukraine from that real aggressor.
до тех пор, пока наша территория, наши границы и справедливость не будут восторжествованы.
Until that time when our territory and our borders are restored.
Thank you, Representative Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to talk a little bit about the, going back to the Charter community that you, of course, we talked about who really focused on this morning. Do we have a number of how many people have actually fled the peninsula? What is that estimated to be?
Since annexation, 50,000 people, including more than 25,000 Crimean Tatars, have fled. But the problem is that they're being replaced by Russians who are primarily military personnel and civil servants. The number that I have is 500,000 Russians.
And of course, I know that there are other faiths other than the Tartars in the area, including the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and Jehovah's Witnesses. Is that correct? Can you talk to us a little bit about what ways that their freedoms have been restricted, even though they're not Tartars, but even though they're associated with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and Jehovah's Witnesses? What issues do they have to deal with by these occupying authorities?
В России существует преследование всех тех людей, которые не входят в Русскую Православную Церковь.
In Russia, they persecute anyone who is not belonging to the Russian Orthodox Church.
На законодательном уровне.
In fact, it's in their laws.
Наиболее две известные это организация это Свидетели Иеговы.
And Jehovah's Witnesses is just the most wide-known organization of such kind.
Которая везде в мире разрешена, но в России она запрещена.
They are permitted everywhere except Russia.
Сотни людей уже находятся в тюрьмах по обвинению просто в причастности к этой организации.
So hundreds of people are kept in prisons on charges of just belonging to that organization.
Их не только сажают в тюрьму, но избивают, пытают и унижают там.
They not just kept in prison, but they are beaten and tortured and humiliated there.
Вторая такая организация мусульманская называется Хизбут Тахрир,
Then there is a Muslim organization, Tibut Takir,
которая разрешена в Украине и других странах,
which is legal in Ukraine and other countries,
но в России запрещена.
but in Russia it is forbidden.
Поэтому часть арестованных татар в Крыму, они осуждены именно за причастность к этой организации.
So some of the Tatars that got court sentences in the Crimea were actually sentenced for belonging to that organization.
То есть не какие-то действия, какие-то преступления, просто то, что член организации.
Not for anything they did, but for just belonging to that organization.
Это преследование по религиозному принципу.
And that's persecution by religious identity,
Которая существует в современной России прямо сейчас, в 21 веке.
which is done by Russia today in the 21st century.
Is it more severe if you're actually in Crimea, in this area? If someone's a Jehovah's Witness or if they're a member of some other church than the Russian Orthodox Church, than it would be, say, if it's in Russia, the country itself?
В России они преследуются, но в Крыму преследуются еще сильнее.
Well, they are persecuted in Russia, but in the Crimea, much more strongly so.
Потому что Крым находится в фокусе внимания российского руководства.
Because the Crimea is in the focus of attention of Russian leaders.
Любое проявление какой-то нетолерантности и даже в религиозном плане вызывает очень сильные репрессии.
So any manifestation of disagreement, discord, even in terms of religious identity, causes strong repression.
Я общаюсь с теми, кто сейчас выезжает из Крыма.
I talked with those who come to Ukraine from the Crimea.
И они говорят об одном, атмосфере страха,
They all talk about the atmosphere of fear.
затхлости, уныния и беспросветности.
It's fear, stagnation, seeing no light ahead, this kind of atmosphere.
Это прямое следствие российской оккупации, которая превратила этот процветающий перспективный регион в захудалое болото.
And this is all a direct consequence of the Russian occupation, which turned the previously flourishing region into some kind of a stagnating swamp of Russia.
I add a little bit. Russian Federation used anti-extremist and anti-terrorist legislation of Russian Federation to to prosecution. Yes, sorry, to prosecution disloyal population in Crimea. For example, they used anti-terrorist legislation among Crimean Tatars and different activists from Crimea, for example, Crimean Solidarity Group. And they prosecute and say that we prosecuted not Crimean Tatars, we prosecute terrorists, and they marginalized this group of people because most of politically motivated cases, which we are now, it's a terrorist case. But most of them, these people, are activists of Crimean Solidarity Group. Crimean Solidarity, it's a group of people which unite families of political prisoners in Crimea, human rights activists and human rights lawyers. And every day, every week, they have searches in their houses. And of course, they are prosecuted not because they are terrorists, because they are activists.
Thank you so much for the question. So there's a really important legal distinction here. Before annexation, Ukraine did not have a human rights problem with its minorities. Human rights were fine in Ukraine. The minority communities were flourishing. The problem
Did that include the Jehovah's Witness?
So the issue is that the Jehovah's Witnesses are illegal in Russia. After annexation, Russian law now applies to Crimea. And Russian law, so it's an imported legal code from Russia that's hostile to religious minorities. And the law has these vague provisions on extremism and missionary activity that can be used as a prosecutor wants. It also has an onerous registration process that can really squelch religious minorities through unreasonable and vague procedures. So bureaucrats can just delay if they want to, if they don't like them. We have specific examples in the last year or two of Crimean authorities either trying to order the demolition of Ukrainian chapels or trying to end leases on churches in Crimea. So the situation is getting worse. It's really acute for anyone who's not part of the Russian Orthodox Church in Crimea.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Wicker. And we've been joined by Commissioner Mark Vesey from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad to see so much attention to this and attendance from both the House and the Senate. Let me just mention, to follow up on what Representative Adderholt brought up with regard to religious freedom and the lack of it in Crimea. I have a bill, S-3064, the Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act.
Repeat the number again, Raj.
S-3064. It is a companion bill to legislation in the House, which apparently the authors have done a better job on than I have, or perhaps they got a head start. But in the House, the companion bill is sponsored by 5 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Representatives Wilson, Fitzpatrick, Bilirakis, Harris, Meadows, Cleaver, Cohen, Moore, our own Representative Vesey, Eshu, Lipinski, and Quigley. So I would mention that as some legislation that perhaps will be helpful in that it would clarify the Office of International Religious Freedom Authority and require that they consider religious freedom violations in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine when considering a, quote, country of particular concern, unquote, or CPC designation in Russia. I would encourage friends of Ukraine and Crimea on both ends of the Capitol Hill, on both sides of the aisle, to co-sponsor that and thank the ones that have.
Yes, sir.
I also would like to acknowledge the question, Mr. Chairman, that you read from representatives of the Open World program. Would they raise their hands? Perhaps, okay, well, yes, hello, ladies, thank you very much. I would mention, Mr. Chairman, that I was there at the inception of the Open World Program, and it was a bipartisan effort with Representative Bud Kramer and me and the strong leadership of Senator Stevens in the Senate, and seeing as how he had such a high-ranking position on the Appropriations Committee, maybe we can give him most of the credit there. But it has been a bipartisan program that we've had to defend as part of the Ledge Branch appropriation bill each time it comes around, because it doesn't seem to fit in a legislative setting. The key to it is, and what makes it so special is we house it in an organ of the Congress, which is the Library of Congress. Wonderful. So when we sponsor exchanges around the world, and it began in Russia and now has moved to areas sort of in the Russian sphere, in the former sphere of the Soviet Union, they know that it's not an organ of first one president's administration and then another, that it is, these are representatives inviting citizens from these various countries to come to the United States, to find out, to live with us, to stay in our homes, to find out how we live and how we actually practice freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion in this country. So thank you for being here. And I'm so glad that Senator Whitehouse appeared today as a member of the Democratic caucus in the United States Senate. We're in an impeachment trial right now, and we certainly are not agreeing with everything that's being said on both sides of that issue. But if there is a silver lining to this cloud of impeachment, Mr. Chairman, it may be the strong cries of support from both sides of the aisle over in the United States Senate to support the freedom fighters in Ukraine. And perhaps I hadn't noticed it to the extent that I have during the arguments both in the House and the Senate, but let's celebrate the fact that day in and day out, people on both sides of the aisle now are talking about how important it is that the United States support our allies who are fighting for freedom in Ukraine, and not only with blankets and night vision goggles, but now in recent years with the lethal weapons that they've been asking for, these tank-busting missiles. And once impeachment is over, we'll get this behind us, Mr. Chairman, and we'll lock arms on the issues that you and I have stood for so long. But that the echo of strong support for Ukraine, and today, the echo of strong support for Ukrainians who live in occupied Crimea is still strong. And I want to thank whoever has emphasized today that Crimea is still a part of Ukraine. The law-abiding international neighbors from around the world, from all over Europe, have resoundingly rejected this sham referendum that took place in Crimea, which was nothing more than a sham, a total farce and a joke, and stated that we may not be able right now to change the physical situation in Crimea, although that is our goal. But we still come down with the strong position that Ukraine is that Crimea is a part of Ukraine. Since FY 2015, the Foreign Operations Appropriations have restricted funds for implementing policies that would recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea. I think it's important that we have done that on a bipartisan basis. And Mr. Ms. Toshiba, I believe you mentioned in your testimony that Secretary Pompeo issued the Crimea Declaration, and you celebrate that, I do believe, which reaffirms, and I quote, as policy of the United States, refusal to recognize the Kremlin's claims of sovereignty over territory seized by force in contravention of international law. In concert with allies, partners, and the international community, the United States rejects Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea and pledges to maintain this policy until Ukraine's territorial integrity is restored, unquote. That's the policy of the United States Congress as adopted in this foreign operations appropriation. That's the strong policy as enunciated by the chief foreign policy officer in the United States of America, Secretary Pompeo, and I very much appreciate that. If I might just ask one question, I've spoken for a long time, but could Mr. Sentsov and Ms. Toshiba tell us what the prospects are of another prisoner exchange, and what can we do on both sides of the aisle here in the Helsinki Commission as we travel in a few weeks, I hope, to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly? What can we do to try to make yet another prisoner exchange a reality? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Наш президент Зеленский заявлял на днях, что следующий обмен уже готовится.
Well, it was announced by our authorities that next exchange is in preparation now.
В этом плане он продвигается, и я из этого благодарен.
And I'm thankful for it being, for this being in preparation and moving on.
Потому что на данный момент около сотни наших заложников находятся в руках в российских тюрьмах.
Because at this time, near 100 of our hostages are held in Russian prisons.
В основном это крымские татары.
And most of them are Crimean Tatars.
И до 300 человек находятся в руках сепаратистов пророссийских на Донбассе.
And close to 300 individuals are held by pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass.
Условия их содержания и точное количество мы можем установить, потому что сепаратисты не пускают на свою территорию никаких мониторинговых групп.
We cannot establish the precise number and conditions in which they are because the separatists do not allow any monitoring groups to come in and see.
А судя по показаниям тех людей, которые были освобождены в декабре этого года, это положение их ужасное.
But according to testimonies from those who were released freed back in December, according to their words, those people are held in terrible conditions.
Там не существует каких-либо минимальных условий, никакого медицинского обслуживания, избивают, унижают и пытают.
Those people are lacking any minimum standards of keeping and no medical help, and they are mistreated, they are humiliated, they are beaten.
И эти люди там гибнут.
So people are dying there.
2 месяца назад нам отдали тело одного такого солдата, замученного сепаратистами в плену.
We are familiar with the case of one soldier that was tortured to death by separatists in captivity.
На его теле были множественные повреждения, переломы, выколотые глаза, а нас утверждали, что он покончил жизнь самоубийством.
Actually, we received his body, and this body had multiple fractures and cuts and burns, and we were told that he committed suicide.
И это ужасные вещи, и мы боремся этих людей, потому что реально их жизнь под угрозой.
And these are terrible things, and it's a threat it kills real people.
Но проблема не только в этом, что есть эти пленные. Пленные — это лишь последствия российской агрессии.
But that harsh imprisonment of people in captivity is only a consequence of Russian aggression.
В Крыму у России находится в заложниках целый народ, крымские татары, 300 тысяч человек.
In the Crimea, Russia held the whole nation as hostages, 300,000 of Crimean Tatars,
которые настроены против российской оккупации.
who are against the Russian state.
И в любое время он может набрать любое число новых заложников.
And so at any time, Russia can put more hostages in prison.
Поэтому, конечно, за освобождение заложников мы обязаны бороться.
So we certainly must continue fighting for release of hostages.
Но это маленькая проблема, и есть большая проблема. Самая важная причина всего этого — российская агрессия,
But
оккупация
this is just
Донбасса.
a little problem, and the much bigger problem is Russian aggression.
Вот про это мы должны в первую очередь говорить, и на это направлены наши усилия — бороться с Путиным до тех пор, пока он не освободит эти территории.
This is why the big issue and what I'm speaking about is the need to continue fighting against Putin until the time when he frees that territory.
Oh, that's right.
Сейчас действительно идет 2 трека, над которыми работает команда Владимира Зеленского.
Your English is actually pretty good.
Yeah, but my English is not good, unfortunately. Now we're working on 2 tracks. One of them is released of people who on the temporary occupied territory Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. And another track, it's persons who in jailed in occupied Crimea and the territory of Russian Federation. It's a very sensitive process, and from your support, of course, it's to do most famous, сделать более известными. More publicity for some names, for example, human rights activists, Server Mustafayev or Emir Hussein, who are from Amnesty International, have this status. Prisoners of conscience, yes. And we understand that this track, Crimean Tatar track, it's very difficult actually, because Russian Federation and Putin don't like Crimean Tatar minority in Crimea, and this process is very difficult. And another issue what I need to mention that Oleg also say, we must fight against Russian occupation, not only about human rights in Crimea, because all of issues with human rights we have because we have occupation. When we don't have this occupation in Russian Federation in our lands, we don't have hundreds of tortures, hundreds of political prisoners. And the main problem, of course, it's aggression of Russian Federation on Crimea and on Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Vesey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a chance to visit the Ukraine a few years ago, and just to be able to see people's everyday expressions there, you can tell that how much this is weighing on the country, and what a concern this is. And of course, here in the United States is a big concern with us too. I was concerned about some human rights issues, particularly freedom of movement in the Ukraine. What are some of the consequences for a resident of Crimea who refuses Russian citizenship, and how at all are their rights, including freedom of movement, being curtailed by occupying forces? Either or, either.
Mr. Shiva?
Yes.
And you can use the translator.
Я только с переводом.
This will be with translation, sir.
В первую очередь следует сказать, что действительно Российская Федерация в силу того, что она вытесняет с территории полуострова крымчан, родило такое понятие в Украине, как внутренне перемещенные.
The first thing I want to point out is as the result of Russia's occupation, because they are ousting the local indigenous population, the Crimean Tatars, we now have a new notion in Ukraine of internally displaced persons.
В Внутренне перемещенные лица, они могут проезжать на территорию Крымского полуострова, имея украинский паспорт, но имея в ней крымскую регистрацию,
Если имеют.
если они имеют.
So these individuals, internally displaced persons who move to mainland Ukraine, are allowed to enter the Crimean territory with a Ukrainian passport on condition that they have residential registration in the Crimea.
Тогда им нет необходимости в дополнительных документах какие-то декларации заполнять на въезде на территорию полуострова.
Then they do not have to fill out any additional paperwork to enter the Crimea.
Если они не имеют крымской регистрации, то эти люди имеют право находиться на территории Российской Федерации в течение 90 дней.
But then if they don't have a residential registration in the Crimea, they're only allowed to enter Russian-controlled territory for up to 90 days.
В силу определенных обстоятельств далеко не у всех крымчан в паспорте есть крымская регистрация.
But many of the people who originally lived in the Crimea and have a Ukrainian passport, some of them, they just don't have a stamp of residential registration in the Crimea.
Соответственно, они могут находиться на территории Крыма со своими семьями только 90 дней, после этого выезжать и только через определенный период опять въезжать.
And accordingly, the Russian requirements make it necessary for them to, allow them to only stay there for up to 3 months with their family, and then they have to leave the territory and come back again.
Фактически крымчане, даже те, которые хотели бы оставаться на территории полуострова, не могут.
So essentially, this does not allow the Crimeans who would even want to live in the Crimea with a Ukrainian passport, they are not able to do that, are not allowed to do that.
Есть часть людей, которая была депортирована с территории полуострова.
Then there is a certain number of people who were deported by Russian authorities from the Crimea.
Депортированы как неблагонадежные,
Deported as people, as unreliable individuals,
потому что они не имеют права нахождения на территории полуострова.
and they are not allowed to be in the Crimea.
К примеру, это касается людей, которые были в статусе получения украинского гражданства.
This applies to individuals who were in the process of obtaining Ukrainian citizenship.
Пришла оккупация, они не успели завершить этот процесс.
So when the occupation came, they were not. This procedure was not complete for them.
Фактически, находясь теперь в статусе без гражданства.
So now essentially they are individuals without citizenship,
Stateless persons.
stateless persons.
Yeah.
Есть другой момент, это пересечение границы и ограничения определенные со стороны украинского государства.
Well, the Ukrainian state also has certain limitations for crossing the border or the administrative line.
Любой гражданин Украины может проезжать на территории оккупированного полуострова.
Any individual from Ukraine is allowed to enter the occupied territory of the Crimea.
Однако иностранные граждане должны получать специальное разрешение для проезда в Крым.
But if you are a citizen of a foreign country, they must receive a special permission from Ukrainian authorities.
Учитывая вопросы безопасности, мы понимаем,
This requirement takes into account considerations of safety.
однако Украина старается максимально содействовать получению разрешений
But
иностранными
Ukraine
гражданами.
is making every effort to facilitate foreign citizens in obtaining such permissions.
Если им необходимо проезд на территорию полуострова для журналистской работы либо правозащитной.
If they need to enter the Crimean territory for journalistic work or for human rights work,
На территорию полуострова можно проехать только через 2 пункта пропуска официальных.
there are 2 official checkpoints between occupied Crimea and Ukraine.
И поэтому любые иностранные граждане, в том числе публичные, которые проезжают на территорию полуострова не через пункты пропуска официальные, они нарушают украинское законодательство.
So any foreign individual who enters the Crimea other than through those official checkpoints between Ukraine and the Crimea, they essentially violate Ukrainian laws.
Поэтому мы вас в том числе просим, чтобы с вашей стороны правительство следило за тем, чтобы граждане Соединенных Штатов Америки, особенно публичные граждане, не проезжали на территорию
And this is
полуострова.
the reason why we ask you to tell your government to watch this and make sure that U.S. citizens, especially public figures, if they want to visit the occupied territory, they don't do this other than through the Ukrainian checkpoints.
Так как Российская Федерация будет использовать это для пропаганды в своих
Because
целях в Крыму.
any instance when somebody from outside visits the Crimea through the Russian territory is used by the Russian Federation for propaganda.
Это используется очень многими европейскими политиками, которые проезжают на территорию Крыма несанкционированно и
There have been
далее.
instances when some political figures from the European countries visited the Crimea without Ukrainian permission.
Поэтому мы со стороны украинского государства, конечно же, осуждаем такие шаги наших отдельных европейских
The
коллег.
government of Ukraine condemns such instances.
Also wanted to ask you about freedom of the press. We've had our own issues, here through social media in the 2016 campaign with Russians trying to influence elections here in the United States and really all around the world. But when it comes to freedom of the press in the Ukraine, are there still any independent news outlets at all that are able to report freely? Are their lives being basically compromised by reporting? I mean, what's going on there in terms of being able to spread information about what's really happening in the occupied territories from media outlets?
Ну, касаемо Украины, то у нас существует очень много независимых СМИ.
Well, in Ukraine itself, there is a big number of independent media outlets,
Которым доверяет народ.
and the people trust them.
Все основные телевизионные каналы контролируются, конечно, олигархами.
Well, prime TV channels certainly are under control of rich tycoons, the oligarchs.
Это 5-6 человек.
That's 5 or 6 individuals.
Но из-за того, что они тоже между собой враждуют, у них нет сговора.
And they are in relations of animosity, so there is no collusion between them.
Поэтому никто в Украине не владеет каким-то монополией на СМИ, как в России.
Which means there is no monopoly in control of the media like you see in Russia.
И мы видим полный спектр мнений по всем вопросам.
So in Ukraine, mainstream media, you can see a whole spectrum of opinions on different issues.
В этом плане в свободе слова в Украине все, в принципе, более...
And that's being broadcast in Crimea too?
А в Крыму принимают это?
Про Крым сейчас расскажет Тамил.
I'm speaking about Ukraine, and I want Tamila to speak about what's in Ukraine, what's in the Crimea.
Okay, yeah.
In Crimea, we don't have any Ukrainian media. After 2014, most of redaction moved from Crimea to mainland. For example, the TV channel ATR, it's Crimean Tatar channel, it's Chernomorska TV channel, and another TV channels and newspapers. Now in Crimea we have only civil journalists actually who work in ground and reporting about human rights violations in Crimea. They write these articles on Facebook page, on Twitter, on Telegram channels, and it's only one channel when we have this information from Crimea. If we say about broadcasting from Ukrainian side to Crimea, it's also difficult because in Crimea they have only satellite, and via this satellite they have a chance to see and watch Ukrainian TV channels.
So they do, the people, they can in some areas watch
Yeah.
Ukrainian television.
They can watch Ukrainian television if they have satellite.
Only if they have satellite.
Yes.
What percentage of the people there have satellite?
It's small.
It's a
number.
very small percentage.
Unfortunately, it's a small number. Or maybe from internet, of course.
What percentage of people in the occupied territories have access to social media like Facebook?
Most of them, actually.
Most of them do. Yeah, so they can get news through that.
If they need it, of course, yes.
Mr. VC, I also wanted to note that after annexation, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty set up a website in 3 languages, in Ukrainian, Russian, and Crimean Tatar. It's called Crimea Realities, and it's excellent. It is the most popular website tracking all the developments in Crimea. So it's an online website. It had 2.4 million visits per month in 2019.
I wanted to ask Mr. Senstov very briefly, what's the oldest age of males that in the Ukraine that you're seeing that are being conscripted?
Раньше было 20 лет, сейчас 18. До какого?
The question was, what is the oldest age you can be?
Yeah.
В каких пределах старшего возраста можно быть призванным на службу?
Ну вот старшего возраста не могу вам сказать точно. Возможно, 25, но может быть больше, я не уверен.
I cannot say for sure. I know that they used to conscript individuals at the age of 18. Now it's 20. That's the lower threshold. But maybe it's until 25. I'm not sure.
Я знаю, что снизили нижний предел до 18 лет, про верхний не могу вам точно сказать.
But I know that this lower threshold was actually recently moved back to 18, from 20 to 18. I cannot tell you about the upper limit, though.
Okay. And finally, Ms. Herron, you may be best to answer this question, or one of the other panelists. I'm not sure who this goes to. But as far as Russia's long-term plan, of course, you know, their goal is to obviously come into an area. They want to be able to have certain control over an area. Do you see this occupation as being long-term, or do you see it as more of a, or do you see the Russian strategy being, let's go in here and indoctrinate as much as we possibly can, and then leave so we can continue to have long-term influence in the area? In the past, you know, they've been reluctant to obviously take in new territories, particularly where they think there's a lot of corruption and they think that it won't fit in neatly into what they want to do long term. But how do you see that sort of playing out? I'm just curious about that.
The Russians have no intentions to give Crimea back, full stop. You have to remember, it was a big PR boon as well when Putin went in and quickly took Crimea. And like I said before, they've sent approximately 500,000 Russians to go ahead and move there permanently. I mean, I can run through. It's interesting when I say that it's become a Russian military base. The amount of equipment that's been moved there and the number of people is staggering. So before annexation, there were 0 battle tanks. There's 40 now. There were 92 APCs. There's 680 now. There are 24 artillery systems. There's 174 now. There were 22 combat aircrafts. There's 113 now. They're not going to move this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Путин, конечно, не собирается отдавать Крым и Донбасс под контроль Украины.
Russia has no intention to return either Crimea or the Donbas under Ukraine back to Ukraine's control.
Поэтому наша стратегия по возврату Крыма и Донбасса должна быть долгосрочной.
So our strategy on a return of Crimea has to be long-term.
Мы должны продолжать давление на Россию, чтобы не дать ей возможность стабилизироваться.
We must continue making pressure on Russia to not allow it to stabilize its presence.
Не позволять мировому сообществу признать эту оккупацию.
And also this should not allow the international community to recognize Russia's occupation.
И продолжать давить.
And continue exerting the pressure.
Рано или поздно власть Путина закончится.
Early or late, one day, Putin's power will end.
Он может либо умереть,
He may either die,
либо могут сместить его преемники в 2024 году.
or his heirs, successors may replace him,
Либо народ России может восстать против этого диктатора наконец-то.
or maybe one day the people of Russia will rise against his dictatorship.
Потому что ситуация социальная очень нестабильная в России на самом деле.
Because in fact, the situation in Russia is far from being stable.
Народ уже устал от всего этого противостояния, от
The
бедности.
people have been tired of all that confrontation.
И такой взрыв может реально произойти.
So an explosion like that is realistic to expect.
Предсказать его невозможно.
It's impossible to predict it, however.
Но такие варианты возможны. И когда после смены власти придет другое правительство в России,
So any of those possibilities may take place, and once there's a new government in Russia,
ему придется искать поддержку за рубежом.
they will have to look for support from international community.
Потому что сейчас в России действует только одна институция, это Владимир Путин.
Because right now there is one single political government institution in Russia. It's called Vladimir Putin.
Все подчинено ему, там нет независимых судов, нет независимого парламента, нет независимых СМИ, гражданского общества, нет ничего независимого.
Everything is subordinated to him. There is no independent courts, no independent media, nothing independent.
Соответственно, когда пропадет главный элемент системы, она вся будет рушиться.
So when that key element disappears, the whole system will collapse.
И кто бы ни пришел на его смену, он не сможет систему стабильно удержать.
And whoever comes to replace him will need to find sources of stabilizing the system.
Ему придется искать опору за рубежом.
And that person will have to look for support from foreign countries.
Вот этот самый момент трансформации власти, Америка, Европа и все наши союзники должны занять четкую и твердую позицию.
And that moment when Russia's power is in transformation, the United States and other allies need to have a very clear standing.
Что она признает новое правительство России и окажет ему помощь, в том числе политическую, в случае, если оно вернет обратно оккупированный Донбасс и оккупированный Крым.
And the position should be very clear that the Western partners will support and give help to Russia only on condition that it returns occupied Donbass and occupied Crimea back to Ukraine.
Опять же, проводя параллели с историей, что оккупация Крыма похожа на оккупацию Балтии в 1940 году.
And again, we can go back to those parallels in history, saying that occupation of Crimea is kind of like occupation of the Baltics in 1940.
Там пришлось ждать 50 лет, чтобы получить независимость.
And they had to wait for 50 years to regain their independence.
Надеюсь, здесь нам придется ждать меньше.
Here we'll probably have to wait for less than that,
Путин 50 лет не проживет.
because Putin cannot last another 50 years.
Но мы должны быть к этому готовы и работать на это.
But important thing is we need to be prepared for that moment when it comes.
Единственное окно возможностей для восстановления статуса КВО.
And that is the only opportunity to reestablish the status quo.
Well, we take your point, and you all have been very generous with your time. If you will just permit me a few minutes to carry what Senator Wicker was saying. Please, particularly Mr. Sentsov and Ms. Tashiva and anyone else that may be from Ukraine, Crimea, or that general area, please don't let what's going on in the United States Senate give you the impression at all that there is not complete support for Ukraine. One day soon, whatever is happening there will be over, but I'll still be the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, and other congresspersons and senators will be about their business. And a part of our business is trying to do what we can to assist in Ukraine. And in my view, the best thing that we could do now is support President Zelensky's effort and those that are like-minded to do the things that are necessary to stabilize that country and to gain its independence. We should not be unmindful, and although it has only been mentioned in passing, that there is a hot war ongoing in Donbass, and that people in that area are dying and are in an embattled situation. So while we didn't cover that this morning, let the word go forth that we need to do what we can to assist Ukraine in being able to carry the day in that area. And for Ms. Tashiva and Mr. Sentsov, I wasn't going to ask you where your families are but I hope that in your efforts, your families are safe, and that anything we can do, if need be, to help. The other thing that I've learned as I've traveled about the world is that civil society is critically important, and so is a justice system that affords due process, critically important. We didn't have time to delve into that this morning, but it's on our minds here at the Helsinki Commission, as well as the religious discrimination that we find not only in Crimea but throughout, and we need to address that. In Crimea especially, I kept saying the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I forgot to mention the Orthodox Church is there as well in some significant numbers to try and assist the Tatar religion effort that's ongoing. One of the things, two of the things that I agonize about when this kind of thing takes place, people that were in small businesses lose their businesses like overnight. Their businesses are gone. And that's not healthy in any of our societies, unless they were closing some of the CVSs that I know about. Then I had to wait 10 minutes to get a razor blade. I'm saying to myself, what's up with this? But I think I know a little bit about it. But my last moment it should be a moment of seriousness. I read a book over the holiday that encompassed a portion of my life. I'm 83 years old, and I grew up in a segregated society in a little town named Altamont Springs, Florida. It's close to Orlando, and of course there was no Disney World at that time. On Christmas night of 1941, I would have been and was a sophomore in high school. A man and his wife were killed. His name was Harry Moore, her name was Harriet, by a bomb that they're pretty certain where it came from, but certainly there was Ku Klux Klan influence that caused that. I remember as if it were yesterday the tension, and that city was 50 miles away from where I live, but their people were fleeing and coming through my area, and some had relatives in my area, and it was a devastating thing. Mr. Moore was the chief executive of the NAACP at that time in Florida, and he was advocating that black teachers should receive the same pay as white teachers. And that's among the things that caused his death. He was a principal of a school, he lost his job. His wife was a teacher, she lost her job. And they had a family, 2 girls, and her mother, and her brother as well. But with that said, Mr. Moore made a statement at a large gathering before his death. And the one thing that was the takeaway from it was freedom never dies. Freedom never dies. One of the things that's troubling to me is how the children are affected in these changes. And I've met dictators, kings and queens, and the Pope, and everyone, and all of us have this extraordinary concern for children, and yet we persist in allowing not just Russia, but other authoritarians and dictators around the world to subject the harshness of what's going on in Crimea to the children. it's beyond unfair, and for as long as I live, I'll be speaking out about it, and that's whether it's to Putin or to his cousin or not to his mama. He doesn't even speak to his mama, who lives in Georgia, I might add. And that's kind of interesting. A person that doesn't speak to their mother, count me out. Thank you all. Thanks so much. I'm going to come down and say hello, and we take some pictures, if that's okay.